and make sure that they go to the right expert so that you will receive your answers. On top of that, of course, as you've seen already, there is the chat field, which can be used for messages to everyone. Yeah, I think this is enough as introduction. We are very happy to start with the first presentation from AlexMcLin. Alex is the director of our neighbors here in the house in Lausanne, the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation, since 2019. He has a background in economics and law and has, among other things, worked for the World Economics Forum before switching to sports with the International Federation of Horse Riding, of which in the end he has been the CEO and Secretary General. He counsels many international federations on governance matters and is a member of the governance task force of the Association of Summer International Sports Federations, and is an arbitrator, including other things also for the Court of Arbitration for Sports. He will introduce you now the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation's work. Alex, the floor is yours.
I should start by muting myself. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Farid. Thank you, Claire, Tina, for putting this together. I think it's great that you're giving us all the opportunity to get together and talk about this issue, which we all know is of great concern to the sport right now. It's something that we at the foundation obviously deal with on a day-to-day basis, but from one particular perspective, which I'm going to share with you today. And I know that the title of this event is towards a positive gym culture. I realize that we're far from we sit as a foundation dealing with the issues that we deal with very far from the reality of the gym. And that said, we're very conscious of that being the ultimate goal, essentially. Making sure that whatever we do contributes to enhancing that culture and making it a positive place to be. I'm probably going to be the driest of the speakers today because I deal with rules. My background is in law, and our foundation is about essentially enforcing those rules. But it's also about providing support. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background because I know that it's become clear to us in the last year or so that we're a young structure and we haven't been around for very long. So the foundation was founded by the FIG in 2019, so we've been operational for about 1.5 years. And we are a small operation. We have 2 staff other than myself that are in the office in Lausanne, Martina Koksova, who's on this webinar currently. So if you contact us, you're either interacting with me or with Martina typically. I'm glad to see that we have a couple of members of our Foundation Council also on this webinar currently, including Slava Korn, who spearheaded and chaired the working group, which ultimately led to the creation of the foundation. So we also, and I believe Ivana Hong is joining us from California as well, who's our athlete representative. So, the idea of the foundation is that we're part of a regulatory framework which sits in the FIG rules, which you're all familiar with. And at the Congress in Baku in 2018, where the foundation was adopted, where the decision was taken and the foundation was voted in, a number of other rules, including policies and procedures, were voted in. And that is the framework in which we all operate. So it's the framework in which we, the foundation, do our work, and it's also the framework in which you, and when I say you, I'm speaking primarily to the national federations, which which are present on the call, but also anyone who needs to find solutions within this framework needs to operate. And so we're conscious of that, and we're conscious that we're only part of the solution, but we think we're an important part of it. And you know, as everyone has a role to play, and we want to share what that role is and what our vision for that role is, and also get your views and questions about that, as the work that we do is obviously enriched and can be better targeted based on your feedback. So we have, as I mentioned, a number of organizations involved, including the ones you're familiar with, National Olympic Committees, as well as the IOC. At the FIG level, we sort of sit at that level and have some links, obviously, with the FIG, and we're funded by the FIG, but we have independent governance, an independent council, and that differentiates us from the other organs of the FIG that have a role to play, including the FIG safeguarding unit, headed by Eunice Lebre, who's also on this webinar. One of the main reasons to create the foundation was to provide this independence, and that's, I think, really what differentiates us as an actor from all of the other organizations on this on this call. We have the ability, by virtue of being independent, to provide a place to contact, a place to report that can be done confidentially and outside of the scope of the governance structure of any given national federation or of the FIG itself. And that's important from the standpoint of trust building. And I want to come back later to what can be done at the national federation level, because I'm conscious that that's a difficult question, and I'm conscious that that's also something that needs to be addressed by virtue of the rules that were adopted last year. But the important thing to retain is that, you know, in the alternative of any independent structure at the national level or elsewhere, we are here, and we're a place that any participant in gymnastics, whether individual or an organization such as a national federation, can contact and get that independent viewpoint. So it can have to, that advice can have to do with a particular case, or it can have to do with the issue of implementing frameworks and safeguards to deal with the promotion of safeguarding. So we have basically three pillars of three areas of activity. Perhaps I'll start with the one on the bottom of this slide, which is safeguarding. We have a safeguarding section, and that one is really focused on this help desk or hotline function, which is a reporting channel for anyone who has to, who's witnessed something, who needs to blow the whistle, who's experienced something themselves and doesn't know where else to go. And from that safeguarding hotline, we will do essentially a triage exercise. First of all, we'll try to provide guidance to the individual involved who's contacted us, and whether they've contacted us anonymously or not, and try to determine what the nature of the issue is, whether or not other parties need to be involved, whether the matter is a criminal matter, if so, whether state police need to be involved, if so, in which jurisdiction, and whether further investigation needs to occur at our level, in which case we will try to identify the right people to conduct that investigation. So all of that falls under the umbrella of the safeguarding section. We have a disciplinary section, which perhaps people are more familiar with because it's very similar to what was the disciplinary body of the FIG. It has simply shifted and is now under the umbrella of the foundation because it's more independent. And then we have a compliance section, which is really focused on ensuring that the FIG complies with its own rules and the other rules that it's subject to, such as, for instance, the IOC Code of Ethics, the World Anti-Doping Code, and the like. So it's quite a broad remit, but we're very much focused on not only adjudicating any or investigating and adjudicating any case that comes our way for purposes of resolving that particular issue, but we're also trying to make sure that that's any given case is really an opportunity to address the underlying cultural issues that case is evidence of. And so we will not stop at adjudicating a given case. We'll try to understand what's led to it and whether there are ways to find solutions. So I'm going to skip over some slides here. Just a note about jurisdiction: we have a means to hear complaints from outside of gymnastics. The idea is that any reporting can come from within the FIG or from within a national federation. It can also come from independent sources outside of that. But really, optimally speaking, the national cases should, to the extent possible, be heard and dealt with at the national level. When I say to the extent possible, that's really to the extent that there's a structure and a mechanism to do that in an effective manner at the national level. And we're very much about trying to make sure that where that doesn't exist, it can, and trying to create essentially lay the groundwork to make sure that that can develop the way that it needs to, because obviously we can't solve every issue from where we sit in Lausanne. Neither is that desirable. But we and the FIG, in setting up the foundation, realized that there was a need for independence, so that in the event that someone doesn't feel like they can approach the individual or the body within their national federation at the national level, that they have an alternative, and we provide that alternative. So we're a mechanism to allow for that reporting and provide that support, a means to receive and manage information that's necessary to ultimately the resolution of a given dispute. We also are a way to appoint independent decision makers for disciplinary matters in a way that's independent of the governance structure. And as I mentioned, a way for the FIG to meet its own compliance objective. We're not an authority with direct jurisdictional power in that obviously national federations, those who I'm speaking to right now, are not members of the foundation directly. They're members of the FIG. And so it is up then to the FIG to enforce any decisions that are taken at the level of the foundation. So there's a number of policies and procedures that, as I mentioned, were adopted last year and which need to be implemented, and they're in various stages of implementation. We realize around the world, including in Europe. we're here to advise to the extent that there are questions on that implementation, but I should state that is not our primary role. The FIG safeguarded unit is there for that, and also has templates available when it comes to rulemaking at the national level, but also with respect to structures that can be set up. This is all the work product of the working group that set up, originally recommended that the foundation be set up. So that, to the extent you haven't looked at that yet, I'm encouraging you to do so. In terms of what we do and how we apply the rules, it's important to realize that we all work from a common understanding of what constitutes abuse, and all of the words that you see on the right side of your screen here are defined terms, and they are defined terms that have a commonly understood definition that the IOC uses, that the FIG uses. So I encourage you to familiarize yourself with those terms so that when we're speaking about, for instance, sexual harassment, we know what we mean, because it's distinct, for example, from sexual abuse. These definitions are not necessarily exclusive of one another. For instance, it's going to be difficult to find a case in which physical abuse is present or sexual harassment is present, but psychological abuse is not a component. All of these, to a certain extent, are constitute psychological abuse. So they're complex concepts, and they overlap, and that's I think part of the educational effort is to reach a common understanding of what we're dealing with. Here you have a flowchart, which is a little bit complex, but essentially it just illustrates what I mentioned earlier. First of all, there's a clear separation between the FIG on the one hand and the foundation on the other hand. Complaints or reports can come in from the FIG side and over to us, as they can come from elsewhere. We will make a determination as to whether or not there should be a criminal report or criminal investigation. If so, that will take place, and we will let that take place before proceeding with any further investigations. That can result in a conviction or not, and whether or not it does, we may still need to proceed at the foundation level with further investigations or with charges for infractions of the sport rules. The standard of proof for in civil cases and when we're talking about sport rules, we're in a civil environment, is lower than in a criminal environment. And so there may be evidence resulting from a criminal investigation, which we may use to further further an action before the disciplinary commission of the foundation. So we will conduct that investigation. If the matter is not criminal in nature, we will still investigate, and we may investigate together with specialists. We have a so-called case management group, which includes experts from various fields, legal, psychological, experts in child protection, and we may involve them given the particular issue involved. We may also assist victims in finding the right kind of help, whether it's legal representation or whether it's psychological help. So these are all parts of the process. Not everything ends up with a procedure before the disciplinary commission, but to the extent that it does, a panel of the disciplinary commission will take a decision, which may then be appealed to the appeal tribunal. It may ultimately then be appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And once that decision is final, then it is to go back to the FIG for implementation. Maybe before I skip to talk about some actual cases, because I realize that I've been asked to cover also some examples of cases of physical abuse. I just want to share one more slide, which is the flow chart that was envisioned by the working group at the National Federation level. And the idea here is to replicate and provide some of these similar services that we provide at the foundation, even if you don't have the benefit of a separate independent governance structure. A safeguarding officer can do a lot and can address any reports that come in, make sure that they're investigated, and make sure that they find their way to the adjudication body at the national level. The one caveat, of course, is that if, to the extent the safeguarding officer is an employee of the Federation, which in most cases will be the case, there will be perhaps a concern if the individual who is reporting feels that they're going against the system, or they're going against decision makers within the National Federation. They may not feel comfortable to do so, which is why we exist, and there's that alternative exists. That said, it may not always be the case, and I think that there's a big effort that needs to go on in terms of building trust at every level. It's something that we're working on at our level, but it's something that needs to happen, as we can see from the recent headlines in many different countries. There seems to be a lack of trust in the national body for whatever reasons. Some of them probably legitimate, others perhaps just issues of perception. But nevertheless, we need to do jointly a better job of building trust, and that will determine the extent to which this system is effective. So I will now move away from the slides for a bit and share with you just a couple of examples of decisions that were taken by the disciplinary commission recently in matters of physical abuse. So the first thing I'm going to share is just a very short video, and I realize that on Zoom this may come through well, or it may not. Towards the end of this video, which is only 22 seconds long, you will see the offense repeated. So the action is happening here. You'll see a coach, this young gymnast, and he's being slapped in the face. And this was caught on camera. So this video was very much part of the evidence that the disciplinary commission dealt with. Incidentally, both examples that I'm going to talk about had video evidence. The second example, unfortunately, that video evidence, which was on YouTube, is no longer there, so I can't share it with you now. But in this case, you had a coach who was, according to his explanation, trying to get his athlete to focus by slapping him in the face. And the disciplinary commission felt that, obviously this was a rule violation. The coach did express remorse, did apologize, and he ended up with a 1-year suspension and an obligation to get training, sensibility training in safeguarding. The second example, and incidentally, each of these, and you're probably all aware of this, but to the extent that you're not, all of the decisions of the disciplinary commission are available in summary form on the FIG website. So you have to just go under the governance tab at the top. And these used to be simply news items, and they're now organized. And I thank the FIG communications department for doing this. They're now all organized and available in one spot. So the other decision that I wanted to highlight was one involving a coach from Chinese Taipei who was caught again on video, and this time really on 2 occasions. And it's interesting to see, I mean, the availability of video evidence just, I think, illustrates just how prevalent some of these things are, because if you see that in certain cases video evidence was made available, you know that whoever took the video knew what to look for, and therefore the people involved typically are individuals who were known to be violent, and so they were just some people were just sort of waiting to catch them on camera. I think this is one of those cases, and this individual was caught twice. Once slapping a gymnast 5 times in a row in the space of 45 minutes, and on another occasion outside the competition venue when she was out with the team, pulling the hair of one of the gymnasts so hard that she pulled the gymnast to the ground, and this resulted in a 5-year suspension, also with sensitivity training, and with a number of questions raised as to whether or not there was sufficient understanding about the extent to which this behavior was simply not acceptable at the level of the Taiwanese Federation. So those are some examples, and they're just examples of physical abuse. There are obviously more, unfortunately, but it's just a little bit to set the stage and to give you a sense of what we deal with, and we're very much aware that you need to deal with this at the national level as well. So part of the message here is you're not alone, and to the extent that our expertise can be of help and assistance to you in developing ways to address this, we're here to be consulted. We obviously don't have all of the answers, but we're here to work with you to help find them. So I think I'll stop there for now. I thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to present to you, and I look very much forward to the resulting discussion. I'm happy to take some questions now or later, Lisa, as you see fit.
Yeah, thanks a lot, AlexMcLin from the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation. You just mentioned how important it is that the safeguarding structure is an independent one. No? We know that the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation is an independent body from FIG. What recommendations can you give to the national federations how to set up the position of an independent safeguarding officer? Because of course, normally the persons employed at a federation are not independent. No? What would be the first step to get that organized?
So I think there's different models. It's a very good question. I think there's different models available. And I'm familiar with those more at the international level, but the FIG approach in creating a separate foundation, I think, is unique as far as what I've seen, and it's it's ideal because you really have that separate governance structure. Obviously, the funding issue is, the funding has to come from somewhere. So we can also be criticized because the funding comes from the FIG. So people can say, well, how truly independent are you? But the reality is that we have decision makers. We have a president who's a former president of the Swiss Confederation, who's able to speak publicly with some clout, and that provides a certain level of independence. So obviously, it's all relative. I think at the most basic level, to the extent that the safeguarding officer is a staff member of the federation, it should not be the Secretary General, right? It should not be the CEO, because the CEO really is the illustration of the authority, right? So if someone needs to come forward and has concerns within the authority, they're going to have concerns coming directly to the CEO. So I don't think you're going to see too many people coming forward if that's the case. I think at its most basic, the role of the safeguarding officer is kind of like the role of a human resources director within an organization, right? Where yes, they're an employee, but at the same time, they're there to serve the interests not only of the organization as a whole, but the interests of those that the organization is meant to serve and employs. And so it's then up to that individual and up to the organization to build trust in that function such that people feel comfortable coming forward. There's also the possibility of contracting out, for example, to an independent either individual or body, or for instance a law firm or the like for the hotline element of it. So if someone feels, so that people feel like if they're calling someone that's not the federation, and where there's certain ground rules that can be communicated that make it easier for people to come forward. So there are various models, and I think you need to find the one that works for your particular circumstance within the resources that you have at your disposal.
Thanks a lot. We'll leave it at that for now. Of course, later on, all our participants can ask questions to Alex. For now, we would like to come to the next presentation from John O'Sullivan. Thank you, John, for joining us tonight. John is the founder of the Changing of the Games project, which he started in 2012. He also wrote 2 best-selling books in the field of athletes and coaches, Changing the Game and Every Moment Matters. He's a leading youth sports blogger and the host of the Way of Champions podcast, one of the top-rated podcasts in the world for coaches. He himself has a background as an athlete and an over 20-year-long coaching career in football and other team sports. He's a member of the National Advisory Board for the Positive Coaching Alliance in the United States. John, we're looking forward to your presentation now.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Alex, as well. That was fantastic and really interesting for me to hear that, as certainly here in the United States, we had a couple of years ago the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and the creation of that, and I've watched people within that organization struggle with an unfunded government mandate to create a program to help investigate abuse of many forms across many sports. And then, Lisa, thank you for reaching out to me, because when you first reached out, I had just, I think like 2 nights before, had watched Athlete A with my wife, and we had watched that. And also here, our big sports channel, ESPN, had done about a 7-part podcast on the Caroli family and USA Gymnastics, which for me was even more enlightening about a lot of the things that Alex was just talking about how you have to have independence if you're going to investigate things. And if it goes to the CEO, if it goes to people at the top, complaints won't be made or complaints get shoved aside. And so thank you for having me here. I'm excited to do this. I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully successfully. And what I would love to talk about, there we go, with you all today is this idea of positive coaching. And I entitled this, right, You Coach a Person, Not a Sport, because this is a quote from my friend, Dr. Martin Toms, and it really, really resonates with me. And I know that in my own coaching journey, this was not necessarily how I started. I thought coaching was all about technical teaching and tactical knowledge and all this. And then I realized that it wasn't. And I realized this a couple of years into my coaching career, and I was coaching at an NCAA university here. And a former player of mine, one of the first kids that I had ever coached, was applying to this university to go to medical school. He was done with his undergraduate program, and he called me up and he tells me this story, and he just says, "Hey, I'm coming up. I'd love to see you." And I'm up there. And he said, "Coach, I just want to say thanks." And I thought, well, what do you mean thanks for what, Pat? I haven't talked to you in a couple of years. He said, every time I was in school and I wanted to stop working out, every time I wanted to put down my books and stop studying, I thought of you. I thought of your words saying, is that the best that you have? Is that everything that you have to give right now? Or can you give a little bit more? And he said, so I just want to say thank you, because your influence has gone far beyond when I coached you. And so I was kind of stunned by this. And when I hung up the phone with him, I turned to the other coach and I told him that story. And he said to me, "Wow, that's great." And I said, "It's not great." I'm like, "That's the worst thing I've ever heard." Because all I was thinking about was that for every kid like that kid, Pat, there was 10 others that I wasn't a very good coach for, that I told to go, don't stop playing football, go take up kayaking or something like that. And all I was thinking was like, man, what have I done here? People actually remember what I say and remember what I do. And so I better be a little bit more intentional about all this. And so what Lisa asked me to do today is maybe give you some tools that you can take back to the local gyms and the local clubs or the own athletes that you work with to create this more positive, inclusive environment. I love this little equation here. This guy named Tim Galway, over 30 years ago, wrote a great book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And in this book, he writes, performance is potential minus interference. So how an athlete performs, or how anyone in any achievement activity, it could be school, it could be music, performs, is their potential, which is their genetics and their hours of practice and whether they're injury free or not, right? Minus interference. And I think the single greatest thing that interferes with performance is between the ears. It's the inner game. And yet I think sports is one of the only places where we think that people will perform better if we as the coaches make them feel worse. And to me, that makes very little sense from a performance aspect. And so I think what we really have to do is we need a big paradigm shift in sport, that we want our athletes to really perform at their utmost, but we need a shift in coaching. We need a shift in how we approach this. And the word that Alex used that I really like, and I'm going to touch on again, is trust. We need more trust between parents and coaches, between coaches and athletes, because when there is this trusted relationship, people are going to perform better. So I'm going to talk about kind of three parts of it today, which is, right, if we want to not deliver just this transactional experience, and by that I mean, oh, well, we teach gymnastics, but we want to make it a transformational experience where it goes far beyond that, then there's a couple of things that we can do. And I certainly understand that as a federation, right, especially with our elite performers, the goal is to win. But I think the purpose of sport is something much bigger and much deeper than that. And what happens when the goal of winning and the purpose only becomes winning, what happens then is sometimes we treat athletes like a carton of eggs, right? And we throw the whole carton of eggs against the wall and we hope one doesn't break. And if one doesn't break and they become an Olympian or they win a medal, we say, ha, see, it works. And I think that's certainly what I've learned in getting ready for this about certainly gymnastics here in the United States, was that we threw lots and lots of eggs against lots and lots of walls. And because a couple didn't break and because we won some medals, we said, look at that, that works. And we turned a blind eye to some horrible stuff. But that change, that has to come from the top. I think it really has to come from the local level, right? And so that starts with all of our coaches being trained, all of our coaches knowing themselves, all of our coaches working hard to know their athletes better, and then this building and understanding trust with parents and athletes and coaches together. So that's what I want to talk about here today. So number one, knowing ourselves. This is one of my favorite quotes. My new book called Every Moment Matters was a book for coaches. And this is the first chapter, the first quote. To be a better coach, you've got to be a better you. And this is from a guy named Joe Ehrman. He was an American football player in the National Football League and just a great coach educator now. And he was very, very influential on my journey to look inside of me as a coach and recognize that it starts with me being better. Now, I think one of the things with a lot of coaches in a lot of sports is that why do people get into coaching? Oftentimes they get into coaching because all of a sudden their athletic career ends. They didn't make it to the top or they got injured. And so they bring some psychological baggage to coaching, right? Of unfulfilled ambitions for themselves as an athlete. And so then they bring this baggage and all of a sudden they're put in charge of children. And that's a very dangerous thing when, as the coach, I haven't come to terms with my own career and I haven't made that transition from athlete to coach. For me personally, I had some really bad injuries. I had to stop playing at 26. And I know when I jumped into coaching, I coached with this attitude of I'm still an athlete and I'm not quite, I'm not ready to coach. And so I coached them like I wanted to be coached. I coached them with this super competitive attitude. And it wasn't necessarily a positive thing. So what I would like to do right now is when we think about, knowing myself and thinking about what does a great coach look like, I'd like you all to explore that yourselves. And so what I'd like you to do in the chat box, and then Lisa or Tina, if you want to, as these things come in, start reading some of them, I would love you to write down some little words or phrases that are the 5 qualities of the best coach that you have ever had, right? So think about yourself. What are the things that, when you think of who's my best coach, what does she look like? What does he look like? How do they make you feel right now when you think back on them? And if you say, I don't know that I ever had a great coach, then maybe you're the best teacher you ever had. So go ahead and put those in there right now. And then as they start coming in, if Lisa or Tina, if you can just kind of read out a few of them, that would be great. Now, if we were doing this in person, what I usually do is I hand everyone some yellow sticky notes, and I would give you all 5 sticky notes, and I would ask you to write these qualities down, and then we would put them up on the wall. So we're going to have to kind of paint this picture virtually here. But go ahead, Tina. What do we have?
Compassion.
Compassion.
Passion.
Passion.
Teaching inspirational understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding in general then.
Please take a second, type those in, because this is an important visual, I think.
There's another one in the question and answers, patience.
Oh.
Patience. I'll add motivation to that as well.
Yeah. I think of my own coaches. I think one of the things is they made it enjoyable, right? They made it fun. It made me want to come back. There is some, Henrik, humor. Okay, fun. So as these come in, what's really interesting, and you can throw in, Tina, any more that come in, but when we start thinking back to who's the best coach I ever had, and what did he or she do, the things that we remember, right? We remember how they made us feel, right? We remember these things, these qualities that go beyond the X's and O's. So if we wrote down these 5 things, and I've done this across the world with every sport, from football to rugby to Aussie rules football to PGA golf coaches and everywhere in between. When we stuck these sticky notes up on the wall, here's what I promise you would see. You would see 80 to 90% of the sticky notes. I always say, okay, we're going to put on one wall, we're going to put all the sticky notes that have to do with knowledge of the sport on one wall. And then we're going to put on the other wall all the sticky notes that have to do with connection or emotional intelligence. And what we'd find is 80 to 90% of all the sticky notes of all the coaches in that room, when you say, what are the qualities of my best coach, would be under the wall of connection. That ability to connect with my athletes, to make me feel a certain way, that's the things that I remember. And this
absolutely. I've got a few more. I'll
please
just
do.
interrupt for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Healthy understanding that losing can be valuable to teach life lessons. Being a good listener. Holistic approach. Self-distanced. Involved with the gymnast as a person, and have expectations of everyone. Empathy. Enthusiasm. Interested in the gymnast or the person and the thoughts. Compassionate, and passion for learning.
Yeah, lovely. I mean, so look at all the, even in the small sample here that we've cut in, no one said, or maybe one said, sort of, technical quality, right? Everything else was about all these other connective qualities, these human qualities, these things that sadly we sometimes say are the soft skills. And the problem is in coaching is that sometimes they're hard to measure, right? But really these things, we've started to value a lot in coaching the things we can measure, because sometimes it's hard to measure the things that we value the most, right? And these are things should be at the forefront of what we teach our coaches. So I challenge you to think about this. And for those of you who are listening, who are old enough and have been, I'm 48 and I'm lucky enough to have been invited to the weddings of former athletes of mine. No one ever said, Coach, I'd like you to come to my wedding, the most important event of my life, because you taught me how to kick a ball, right? That's not what it is. Coaching is something so much deeper than that. That knowledge wall makes you a trainer, and the other one makes you a coach, and takes you from a transactional thing to a transformational thing. Now, there's some recent research in the US that's still being expanded upon, and it was part of the Aspen Institute here. We had a 12 and under sports initiative called Project Play to stop the dropout rate. And here's what the research said, where across these children, these were the qualities of the best coach: respect and encouragement, positive role model, clear communication, knowledge of the sport, someone who listens. And these are the same things that came across in all your sharing in the chat room there too. And when people say, well, that's not what I do, I say, well, look at the opposite, right? Do we do better when someone disrespects us or discourages us, or is a terrible role model, or doesn't listen, right? Or doesn't communicate clear expectations, or doesn't know what they're talking about? Of course not. So this model of the ideal coach is something that we have to teach from the top down, and from the bottom up, right? Within every organization, within every local club, we have to have this idea of, well, this is what we reward in coaching. Now, all too often, the only thing we reward because it's so tangible is, did you win? But again, that might be the goal, but man, I think the purpose is something so much bigger than that. So how can we be a better you? You know, number one, I think we have to teach our coaches. And when I look at the video that Alex shared of the coach slapping his athlete, right? He slapped him out of a reaction, right? And we have to teach our coaches, don't react, respond, right? Our reaction is sort of our personality and what pops into our head, and this sort of lack of self-awareness, right? While a response is an indication of our training. When we train ourselves, right? When we develop character, then we don't just react. We learn to respond. We learn that if this is an incident that's going to cause me to get upset, I need to learn to walk away. I need to learn to be quiet. I need to learn to take a deep breath, right? That's a response. And sometimes we need help from our other coaches or the staff around us to respond appropriately and not react. I know I still do sometimes, right? I have sometimes in games where I have to sit there and say, you know what, I need to let these kids play today. And then I'll turn to my assistant coach and say, if you see me get up out of my chair, your job is to grab my shoulder and pull me back down, right? Because I need a reminder sometimes. So that little equation, right there, E plus R equals O, event plus response equals outcome. Now, we don't control the events, the mistake that happens, that loss that happens, but we do control our response, and that R has a far greater effect on the outcome than the event does itself, right? Number two, be demanding, ask a lot, but not demeaning. And I see a lot of coaches crossing this line far too often, right? That they think they're being demanding, but really what they're doing is they're demeaning their athletes. They're attacking their person. They're shaming the person. They're making the person feel worse, right? Whereas demanding is having and upholding a high standard of how we do things here. And there's lots of ways to be very positively demanding by giving the athletes ownership of that experience, right? And fostering intrinsic motivation without demeaning them. And when we cross the line into the demeaning, the positive coaching doesn't exist right there, right? And then I think really from a big standpoint, right, knowing our why. Why do I do this? Why do I coach? When we really strip away all the things of why coaches are there, a lot of them are there because sport had a great impact on their life and they want to give back. They want to do more. They want someone to be there for athletes like someone was there for them. Right. And so one of the things that I advise is, like, I think every coach should have kind of a coaching purpose statement, right? This becomes sort of your North Star, the thing that you always go back to when you're struggling, right? This provides the bumpers, if you will, of what's appropriate and what's not. So I'll share with you mine, right? This is why I coach, right? To build a lifelong love of activity in the children I mentor, and to use the power of sport to intentionally develop character and transform lives for the better. When I coach, I want the kids to win. I want them to compete hard. I want them to be successful. But I think I've done it long enough now where I realize that it's something much more powerful than that. And when I talk to the kids that I coached 20 years ago, what they remember, they don't remember the wins and losses, the championships, as much as they remember the camaraderie, the hotel, the things that they got from sport, right? Belief in themselves that they didn't have before. And I really believe sport is one of the most wonderful places that we can teach this, right? And if coaches are intentional about doing it, to develop character, to transform lives, to make people believe in themselves, that's a very powerful thing. And so this is my North Star, and this can change and this can shift. And it's certainly very different now. It was much more transactional 20 years ago. But I think this is what I always come back to on the bad days, especially, that, hey, this is part of the journey. This is part of the process. Okay. So knowing yourself, knowing your athletes, right? I love this quote, George Bernard Shaw: the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that has taken place. Right? The single biggest problem in teaching is, just because we taught it doesn't mean that they've learned it. And so one of the things that I've worked very hard on in my own coaching is to try to communicate better, to try to strip away the layers and get to know my athletes better, the people, the children that I work with, right? Which today is 12 and 13-year-old boys. That's who I happen to be coaching in this day and age. That's my son's age, right? And so kind of two ways to do this that I think are really powerful. This first one comes from Karch Karai, and Karch Karai is the U.S. women's national team volleyball coach. And he's a really fascinating character because, the greatest male volleyball player of the 20th century, and, incredibly successful. And he's had a great run as a coach as well. And one of the things, his practice environment is fascinating to observe. It's an environment full of mistakes. It's an environment that's constantly pushing people to beyond their limits. So it's very, very demanding, but it's also very safe to make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not working hard enough. You're not pushing yourself hard enough. And it's this great environment of self-awareness as well. Right? So can you see what you're not doing? And the coaches are there to support you. And one of the things that Karch Karai does in every athlete meeting that he has, the last thing he says to them is that, how can I be a better coach for you? How can I be a better coach for you? Because I want to know what makes you tick. I want to know what's working for you right now. And I want to know what's not working. And when you create this environment where athletes have a say in that, you can learn what kind of communication is better. You can learn that maybe you have to listen a bit more. You can learn that maybe they like when you raise your voice to them, and others who say, can you just have a quiet word with me? And then the second thing that I've started doing, and I learned this a couple of years ago, and this has been one of the most eye-opening things for me as a coach. And I got it from a teacher who wrote a book. It was called I Wish My Teacher Knew. And this was an inner city teacher. Her name was Kyle Schwartz. And she was trying to get to understand her students in the inner city better. And many of them were immigrant children. And so she asked them a question. And she kind of asked them to complete this sentence, right? One thing I wish my teacher knew, I write coaches, that would help them teach me better is ... And what she learned in that moment was how many kids wrote in, my dad was deported and I haven't seen him in 5 years. My parents are divorced. There's 8 of us living in a 1-bedroom house. And that lens into those children totally changed the way that she taught. And so I said, why don't I do this as a coach? Wouldn't I be a better coach for my athletes if I knew something about them? So I asked them to finish this sentence. I give them a piece of paper and I say, one thing I wish my coaches knew about me that would help them coach me better is ... And I say, don't tell me, work on my left foot or, something like that. Like, I'll figure that out. I need to know, right? Something that I might not ever find out. And what I've learned from the children that I've coached is, right? My parents are divorced. My dad has cancer, all sorts of things. I had a coach, I told this to a group of football coaches once, soccer coaches, and a year later, I was speaking to a group again, and this guy comes up to me after, and he says, that sentence you asked me to finish, it saved a kid's life on my team. And I was stunned, and he sat down and he had tears in his eyes. And he told me, he said, I had a girl on my soccer team, and her parents had both lost their jobs, and they were getting evicted from their house. They were going to have to go live in her car. And she said, I can't live that way. I'm going to end my life. And she wrote this down for the coach, finishing that sentence. And he read this, and he ran to the school, and he got the counselor to talk to the girl and got her help. And the team found out, and all the parents on the team chipped in and paid 6 months of rent so that the family could stay in their house. Right? And then dad gets a job, and then mom gets a job, and they get back on their feet. And he tells me this with tears in his eyes. He's like, if she didn't have this opportunity, if I hadn't invited her to share this, who knows what would have happened. And so the more we can know our athletes and what we make them tick, the better off we can be. Now, this gets into an area of safe sport where when things come to us, right, there might be moments where this has to go well beyond our club, right, if this answer comes back. But this might be a child's first chance to open up about something that's going on. In the United States right now, as a coach, I'm what's called a mandatory reporter. So I don't know how that works country to work, but in the United States, if something from sexual abuse or physical abuse comes across my plate, I don't have any choice but to report it, right? And so that's never happened to me at this point, but it could. But if I do these, let's just go for the 99.9% of cases. If I start asking players, how can I be a better coach for you? If I keep reading these answers of one thing that I wish my coaches knew about me, it would help them coach me better. Now I'm building this connection with athletes at a much, much deeper level. And this feeds into this trust, right? Understanding and building trust with parents and kids. And so I put this picture up here. This guy here is called the Great Blondin. And the Great Blondin is a very famous tightrope walker from France. And he used to come to the United States every year in the late 1800s. And this is a picture of him tightrope walking across Niagara Falls, this giant waterfall, 150 meters above the ground, and 75, 100 meters across this giant canyon. And he was this great showman. And every year he would kind of up the ante with what he would do. So one year he shows up with this cart. And he says, I'm the Great Blondin, and it's hard to see in the picture, but in the back on the bridge, there's thousands of people watching him. And he says, I'm the Great Blondin who thinks I can tightrope walk across the falls. And everyone's cheering his name, right? Blondin, Blondin. And he says, who thinks I can push this cart across the falls? And they're all cheering his name. They're like, Blondin, Blondin. And he says, who wants to get in the cart? Nobody. You know why? Because trust isn't just about ability. I wish someone told me that when I was a 25-year-old coach. I thought because I was a professional athlete, everyone should trust me. But when I had my own children, I realized that trust is about so much more than ability. Trust is about connection. Trust is about being believable, right? Not just saying nice words and talking the talk, but walking the walk. And trust is also about admitting when we get it wrong. And I think a big part about positive environments and safe sport is it's never going to be perfect because we're dealing with human beings. But when we fix it right away and we jump in and we intervene, right? When we admit that we were wrong rather than try to cover it up, we build trust. And I think in many sports, but I think in gymnastics, we've lost that trust. And this really hit me the other day as I was putting the final touches on this presentation, and I was looking and I did a Google search for pictures of coach and gymnast. And I would say that of the results that came up for me to grab pictures, 90% were stories of abuse. That was the picture that I was looking at. And I had to read every article before I stole a picture because I didn't want to put up a picture of a coach who was in jail. We need to rebuild trust, right? And that starts with at the grassroots level, at every club, building this positive environment, building these connections. So I want to leave you with this. Right before COVID hit, so in the end of February 2020, I was in Cleveland and I was working for the NBA team called the Cleveland Cavaliers. And one of their big charitable causes is this place called Blessing House. This was a home that was built in 2005 in inner city Cleveland, where children who were in, terrible family situations could go and stay and live before they entered the foster care system. And so this was this emergency place where, a child would, be born and mom would end up in jail or dad would end up in jail, or the parents overdosed on drugs and died. And some kids might spend, a week here or 2 nights here. And some kids would spend, up to a year in this place. And this was this amazing home founded by 2 nuns. It was incredible. And I got to tour, and most people don't get to go in it, but I got to tour this house. And as I walked around, I noticed that all the downstairs walls had these handprints and these footprints on them with a name. And what they told me was every child who had ever gone to Blessing House had put their hand or footprint on the wall. And now 15 years later, many of those children were adults, and they would wander in off the streets from time to time. And they would go look for their handprint. They would go look for their footprint. And what they would say is, this was the first place in my life where I felt safe. This was the first place in my life where I had my own clothes to wear. This was the first place in my life where I had food to eat. You saved my life. Thank you. And I was stunned by all these. And then what hit me that night was, I think as a coach, I think as someone who runs a gym, as someone who runs a sporting organization, every athlete that crosses through our path, they put a handprint on our wall. And I started to really think about, what would those kids come back and say about us 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And I think what I learned from Blessing House is, if you are intentional and you create a safe place and you bring a lot of love and a lot of respect and a lot of encouragement, right? You push those people forward. And that's our purpose, I think, as sporting people. That's our purpose as federations, is, yes, we want to win. That's a goal, but we have to do something much better. So I encourage all of you to go back to your federation, to go back to your gym and really think about this, right? Think about the handprints on your wall, right? Think about all the children that have passed through your gym. What are they going to say, right? What are they going to, what's their memory of this place? And hopefully it's something that's a little bit bigger than, I won a lot of ribbons, I won a lot of medals, right? I think we need change in sport, right? And one of my favorite quotes, the anthropologist Margaret Mead, right? She says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. Right? We can make changes in our sport, in this beautiful sport, bit by bit, gym by gym, right? Place by place, right? That's what will change, and that's what will make it a much, much safer environment. Okay. So this is all my information. I wanted to give to you this first book I wrote, Changing the Game, which is all about creating this right mindset. That little link right there, take a picture of that. You go to that link, you can download it for free. Take it and enjoy it, and hopefully get some ideas that you can bring back to your federation or gym from it as well. So, Lisa, that's all I got. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, John. This was very interesting. Indeed, I think trust and confidence are feelings which got a little bit lost in gymnastics throughout the recent months. So all of us together have to work now on getting that back in a way, to get back the confident feeling in the gyms. You said that positive coaching needs to be taught from the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom. I think most of our participants today are actually rather from the top at the senior management level of their national federation or their continental union. What should be the first step on the top? We're talking about persons who are very much involved in decision making in their national federations, but they are not every day in the gym. They are not every day next to the coach and the gymnast. What would be the first step for them to move with coaching forward?
About 12, 13 years ago in the United States, our ice hockey federation, USA Ice Hockey, had the same question posed to them. And one of the things they did, they were making some big changes in hockey, from game sizes to physical contact rules to getting rid of national championships and things for very young kids. And so what they set up at that time was what they called it their USA Hockey Model Club program. So what they did was they outlined these certain criteria of what does the ideal ice hockey club look like. And then they identified, and I think they started then with 8. I think today there's only 22 or so in the country. But what they did was they said, that's what it looks like when it's done right. And so they identified and they put their sort of their money where their mouth was and said, because we've now identified you as a model organization, we're gonna give your coaches extra training, right? So we're gonna send our trainers out there to make you better. We're gonna give you equipment and grants to run better programs. And so they supported the people who were doing it best with finances and resources. And then they created this sort of badge that those clubs could put on their website that said, we've been identified as one of the best of the best. So it became a business differentiator as well. So when they took the long-term approach, or they said, hey, we're going to play small-sided cross ice hockey, and the club next door said, oh, that's silly, we're going to play on a full sheet of ice, or we're going to let 8-year-olds check each other into the boards. What those clubs got to say is, no, we're doing it right here, right? We're doing it right. And our federation has identified us for doing it right. And so this is where I think we can, as from the top, not only through our coaching education, really identifying what are the things that we need to teach coaches, but from our top, say, who are the gyms and who are the coaches that are really doing this right? And can we, highlight their work? Can we shine a light on our bright spots? Because if we shine a light on our bright spots, we're far more likely to get people to emulate them than if we just say, hey, great job, and we shove them back in the corner.
Thanks a lot. Before we come back to more questions possible, of course, also to John, we first have our third presentation of tonight from Katherine Starr. Katherine, welcome. The floor will now be yours. Katherine has high-level sports experience herself as a 2-time Olympic swimmer. She founded Safe for Athletes in 2011 as a result of having suffered from sexual abuse during her career herself. Since then, she is a strong advocate for athlete rights and pressures sports governing bodies to adopt stronger policies for safeguarding in all of their clubs and programs. Katherine, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you both Alex and John. Wonderful presentation, so happy to have sat through that. I'll be a combination of Alex with a little bit of dry and how to work with athletes. So I got asked to, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of Safe for Athletes, but I did get asked to talk about sexual abuse. So I'm going to start talking about that before I switch over to, I can screen share and show you Safe for Athletes, but I'll do that in a second. So one of the things with coach athlete, where I where I specialize, and I spend a lot of time on legal cases here in the United States, and I've worked on international cases as well, and I was involved in the IOC's definitions for the latest definitions for on harassment in sport, as well as on the advisory board for the Center for Safe Sport. And one of the areas that I have found, and I'll talk a little bit further in my presentation around the coach athlete sexual abuse, is the character of the coach is often very charismatic. And so we have this idea that they're positive, they're a good coach, they've excelled the athletes, and there's the fooling for the institution and for the athlete. So, and I can talk more, it's really a whole conversation for me to get into, like, how that, how the roadmap gets to that point, and when does it diverge off into a good coach, and when is that good coach identified as being a sexually abusive coach. And so I can go on another topic to go further in detail on that. But essentially, one of the things that happens in sport, across any sport, is that the moment an athlete commits to their sport is when the vulnerability of sexual abuse is where the peak and where it begins. So why we see in gymnastics quite young is that the peak of gymnastics is far younger than, for example, cycling. Like, you have to be 18 to participate in the Olympic Games in cycling, yet the same amount of sexual abuse would happen within that sport based on the sort of per capita amount of athletes, because the same dynamic exists between a coach and an athlete, but then it's considered consent of age. So it's less recognized. While many of the rules in the United States have changed to identify that, it's not in the media and it's not widely recognized in that regard. So, and as far as, like, when I started Safe for Athletes, I'm going to switch to my screen share and pull up my presentation. So when I started Safe for Athletes, oh, here we go. Full screen. Okay. When I started, it was based on what did I need as an athlete? So I spent, as a very young athlete, I was sexually abused when I was 14. I started getting groomed when I was 13, and I was on the national team at 14. And the structure, and we talk about the trust within the institutions, it was a combination of many elements beyond just trust. There was a lack of place to go, a person to talk to. And so Safe for Athletes, the model of policy is developed based on, well, what would have helped myself in the situation, even going back when I was an athlete in the 80s. I was on the 84 and 88 Olympic Games, just to age myself. And so Safe for Athletes, we advocate for athlete welfare. Every athlete is provided a safe and positive environment free of sexual abuse, bullying, and harassment. And so what the structure of Safe for Athletes is policy driven for the local level. And what's more important is the way we have our program set up is that we have an athlete welfare advocate, which is an unbiased person. And so we've talked about that within the federation. And so what we bring to the local level is for athletes to have that direct source and nowhere to go to get to have a conversation about what's happening and transpiring. And then our policies are structured to have a response tool. So how Alex outlined where the hotline, we have, a place to come into Safe for Athletes as far as, complaints, and then how to address them. So whether we're sending them over to Safe Sport, whether we can send them into an NGB overseas, we have the structure to be able to send wherever it needs to go. But essentially, we need to get the information out of the system. So the system is only as good as the structure that you have with it. And so what I have found, or what is the general problem, is the number one problem for athlete abuse is figuring out who has the power and jurisdiction to do something about it. So in when you're dealing with the NGB and you have a structure, and we have, you know, with all the management folks that we have on this webinar, is we have the person in the gym that has an experience of issues that haven't arisen to that of sexual abuse. And so where do you go? Like, who do you talk to? Whom can you have a conversation with, as opposed to internalizing what's happening to you? And so, and there's this, you know, things, and then the way that the mind is working, and somebody who's in the process of being groomed, is that they're now readjusting and they're convincing, one is convincing themselves that this isn't abuse, or this isn't, you wouldn't even have those words. As a young person, you don't even have the words. You just have this experience that it's leading off in a different path. And so, and the convincing of yourself that this is okay, this is part of training, this is what my coach does. It's no different than he's spoken, you know, to another, you know, gymnast or another athlete. And so there's a lot of justification that goes on within an athlete in the process, in the grooming process. And that's where we want to go with all of this, to be able to get it before it gets into the sexual abuse. So, and so how, like, so how, say, for athletes versus the governing bodies, and since we have a lot of federations on here, is that what I have found, I don't know how many cases that I have dealt with, but one of the things that I knew, so I was responsible for Larry Nassar to come forward. And when I started Safe for Athletes, I knew that I needed to have trust within that community. I'm not a gymnast. You know, I'm a swimmer. I'm a foot taller than anybody in the gymnastics world. And just a very different sport, but I knew how sexual abuse was in the system. But I also know, and so I had befriended them all. And I knew at some point in time, they trusted me, they knew I had knowledge, and I'd established myself that I would get that fateful call, or in this case, fateful text, and be able to then reach out and start that process going. And what I have found is even in that conversation, when I started on the situation with Larry Nassar, I had a call. It wasn't even about Larry Nassar. It was actually about something else. And it was me understanding what they were talking about. And so as a result of that, I was able to get to what the real issue was. And so if you don't have a significant understanding of how the abuse is in the system and how it's affecting the athlete or what they're saying, then much of this just goes over someone's head. So it just misses the boat completely. Hence why I believe this stayed in the system for so long. And then I've also found over the years that I have been working with athletes is that they don't communicate in a straightforward fashion. Like they don't walk up and say, my coach is sexually abusing me. That is not a conversation that typically that you would have. And so it often comes in other elements and in other ways. You see it in their performance, you see it in injuries, you see it in their change of friends, you see it in other disconnects that are happening within the sport. And often it's been just related to, oh, the next group of athletes is coming up. Like there's justifications that come along to make this determination. And there isn't a big thought process to go and investigate or pursue the change that's happening within the athlete. So what I have also found around facts about bringing those forward is that the policies are so complicated, and you can't expect 10, 11, 12-year-old or a 15-year-old to be able to articulate within a structure of policy or in clarity of just plain language of their experiences. So I've had to help translate out to get to the facts, to be able to identify the incident, to be able to then determine how to respond to that. And so I have worked with clubs that have implemented Safe for Athletes, that they'll bring in the information, and I've worked with them to do investigations and to to develop really what the facts of the situation are. And what we have found in going to governing bodies versus on the local sports and response time is there was a most recent issue in regards to a gymnastics situation this past summer, where the issue went into the Center for Safe Sport, and due to the backup that they have on the response time, there was multiple sexual abuse victims that occurred from the moment of reporting until a response happened. And so the benefit of Safe for Athletes being in place is that, one, you have the ability to have localized, non-biased resource, and how to respond. So we can respond through the issue, we can identify, send them to the various, we follow the same structure on Safe for Athletes website, we have the flow chart of where all the information goes. But we have the ability to take immediate action locally and then support the rest of the process, whether it's criminal, whether it's to the center, whether it's to a federation. But that's the benefit of having all of that there. And I'm an advocate about the reason that I do this is actually to motivate and teach athletes to be able to communicate what's going on within them. And it's about, for me, being a better athlete. And what I have found is that one of the things that I say is one of the taglines of Safe for Athletes is to give athletes a voice. And what I mean by that is we go through the process of athletes, they suppress their voice in order to perform. And we come to a place where we become very compliant to our coaches. And we come to a place where we've been taught to respect. We've been taught all the great things with our coaches. But when you're taught all of that with a coach who's going to cross those lines, then the athlete now is in a position of extreme vulnerability and harm. And then also the institutions are at a place of extreme vulnerability because they haven't taken action towards that. So it's identifying the coaches who are going to cross the line in advance. And I'll talk more about that shortly. So the Safe for Athletes program is designed to create consistency across all sports programs. So it doesn't matter if you're gymnastics, swimming, track and field, cycling, the design of the program and the policies are designed to be consistent. And I believe the Center for Safe Sport is trying to do the same thing. The problem is this delay in their response time to be able to take immediate action, as I just shared. And as I mentioned, we gather the facts and we'll send them off to the various NGBs. We will work with the local organization to do that and to be able to respond. And one of the clubs that we have running Safe for Athletes, we have stopped several incidences that have started off very small. And so these small incidences didn't get to a place where they could have done. I've seen roadmaps that from these types of incidences that end up in significant harm done to athletes. And so if we're waiting for the big actionable item, then that's where I believe the system, like it's already a problem if it's gotten to the federations or it went, it's, like there was a significant amount of problems that happened locally that you're never even going to know about. You're just going to get the last part of the situation, or most likely you're not going to know about. So I'm all about stopping it at the very beginning of the phase. And so, and we've seen that successfully be addressed across Safe for Athletes clubs. So what is the benefit of working with Safe for Athletes and having this locally across all of your gyms? It doesn't require expertise in policy. We're already developed. As I've mentioned, our athlete welfare advocate, and it also supports the through process. So it can connect right into what the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation is doing. It can connect right into any of the NGBs. We use consistent definitions that are in alignment with the IOC and Safe Sport in the United States. And they're presented as a work-through solution when they get to the institution, so they actually have a higher success rate, as opposed to starting from scratch, trying to figure out the information, things get lost in translation. We want to avoid that to the best of our ability to really support athletes when they first come and need assistance, whether it's their parent, whether it's the athlete. We want to be able to identify the issues succinctly and quickly. So, and as I mentioned, give an athlete a voice. So one of the things that I have found, and they use the word proactive policies. And so I have found on many legal cases that I've been involved in as an expert, is that the signs were there and they weren't the actions weren't taken. Even the education is in the system around grooming, and grooming generally falls under like what proactive policies are. And so for me, what I would like to see change is having a stronger structure set up around what to do within the proactive policy section and how to address grooming in an effective way that athletes they aren't, where the grooming ends is when the grooming, and it doesn't move into sexual abuse. And we also have to understand that both the parent and the athlete are in the process of being groomed. So often, and then the team is groomed, and you're into this illusion of this charismatic coach. And so how to create and separate from a charismatic coach that's creating champions. So how do you do that? Like, so how do you pull that out of the system effectively in a way? And so for me, where I'm at and what we're developing at Safe for Athletes, for me, it's about teaching athletes how to tell the truth. And nonstop, like giving athlete a voice implies, one, they're not speaking, and they're not, like, if you're not speaking, you're not saying something, you're therefore lying. It's a version of lying. It's a version of withholding. And so how do we teach athletes to be able to share their experience truthfully? So what I have done is we're releasing this later in the fall, probably January due to sport being on hiatus, is an athlete integrity program that I have partnered with the group, Handel group, a life coaching group, and we're using their methodology within to develop athletes in a way to be able to communicate effectively, to increase, not just to address sexual abuse or any form of abuse, but to increase the athlete's ability to communicate with their parents, with their coaches, with their environment in integrity, in a way that also rises up their athletic experience. The design is to reduce injuries. The design is to learn how to connect to the voices that are truthful within yourself. Because it's all the lies that we tell ourselves along the way. Oh, USA Gymnastics isn't going to do something, like you've believed something, and therefore you're not going to move forward. And so when we talk about trust, we got to learn how to trust within ourselves, how to be able to articulate, and then I will work with, on the institutional side, how to receive that information so it can be responded to. And to me, that's how you're going to build the trust back in the system. So let me teach athletes how to be able to share their experience in a way that can be responded to, and let me help the institutions be able to hear it in a way that can be addressed effectively to increase the trust and the manner of which they need to develop in the process of where we're at. And I want to be sensitive to time. So, and so part of the tools, and so the character of the coach, and I shared a little bit about this, is a very charismatic and a successful coach. Is often, that's the character of also a sexually abusive coach. So being able to split that out, I believe, comes from having a supportive structure in our athlete integrity program to be able to support that and be able to identify those things. And for a reason that I'm appreciative of my own gift, is I have the ability to hear it. And most people don't have the ability to be able to go, oh, that's wrong, that's off, that's not right. That I am able to dig in deeper and to be able to get to that truth, hence where I got to addressing the issue around Larry Nassar. And so tools for coaches. So how can we help our coaches? Clear boundaries, clear structure. code of conduct, and having a response to that violation of the code of conduct. So it's not just a piece of paper, but that's where the responses can come in, and clear communication, and of course integrity, which is a big thing for me. But I also believe that the coaches surrounding the coaches are the ones who actually need the support, who witness and are aware of these issues that transpire. So instead of having to hold in the lie, hold in the knowledge that they have about a coach, is that they too need a structure of support to be able to get both to get the facts straight and be able to articulate it, and for federations to be able to respond effectively and swiftly with those coaches that don't come with repercussions. And I've had coaches who are big named, also Olympian coaches, that have asked me to address things internationally, that have known, like, I'm grateful for the fact that my Olympic community and a lot of Olympians, or many Olympians, also coach, that they know, call Katherine. Like, so like my network of people is so they don't have to then expose themselves as a coach, but they want the issue addressed. So there's a lot of fear of other coaches not being able to see a pathway to support, to be able to get that out of the system. So, and so that will be, I'm going to switch off of screen share, and let's see what we got here. Let me see, stop, apologize. This is new share, maybe if I put my glasses on. Okay, where's my stop screen here? There we go. Okay, thank you for my technical slowdown. And so, so as far as like, you know, supporting our coaching staff. And then one of the questions that I was asked, I sort of shared a little bit about it, is gymnastics having a higher risk of abuse than other sports due to its large participants of young female athletes, and what gymnastics can do to prevent risks. So I feel like the answer to your question is yes. And the answer to that is because of the early peak age, as I've identified. And I believe that the issues start locally, and I believe we need structure locally then to feed up all the way through the federations. And that's what I feel is going to be the most effective way to build trust within the gyms, within the sports environments, and within the institutions as well. And then combined with working directly with athletes and developing their integrity around participating in sport. And it's a whole methodology which is a whole separate conversation on how that all would work for them, but we will roll it out in multiple languages. So it will be supported in certainly French, German, Italian, and of course in Spanish as well as English. So we will have that internationally available as well, because our intention is to especially help our elite athletes who are at the most vulnerable. The higher you are in participating in your sport, is the least likely you are to communicate a level of abuse that you've become normalized within yourself, and you've decided that, or you've determined that that is what is driving the success. And so for me, it's shifting it over to an internal drive that's not dependent on a coach. Essentially, let's move the power back to the athlete and out of the coach's hand, and let's create equality between those two relationships. So that is where I'm going to help athletes and address the issues. So thank you again, Lisa, and the European Gymnastics Federation for having me. And I hope you found something that was of value for your federations.
Thanks a lot, Katherine. Indeed, a very interesting input. Among your own work, you also work as advisor for other institutions on the topic of safe sports, also for the IOC. Do you think there is an understanding in the IOC that the sports culture must change? Not only gymnastics need to think about that, but also other sports, and the IOC, of course, is at the top of that. that we really need an emphasis on safeguarding for the athletes? Has the IOC understood that?
So the IOC has resources in place, and they have worked to address within the federations. However, I feel what they lack is leadership in addressing the issue that can be responsive across all of the sports. And I have worked in pretty much every single sport. I have been involved in a sexual abuse case. So this is not just for the gymnastics community. Know that I have dealt actually with more horrific cases outside of gymnastics. And so as far as the IOC goes to support that, I feel that there isn't a person that is recognizable and spearheading in a meaningful way that people see that the IOC is taking a leadership role. Ideally, I'd like to do that for them, being that I am an Olympian and have been spearheading this for a while. I'd like to move in that direction to be able to address that, and where the athletes can see that that they can build trust in the Olympic movement again, because I believe that some of that has been compromised over the last several years.
Thanks a lot. So now we still have a good half an hour left, and a large audience still of almost 90 people. Dear participants, now the floor is yours. Please send us your questions over the question and answers field so that the experts can answer.
I'll start with the first question. It's one to Alex. When a case is under investigation, what happens to the people involved? And to go a bit further on that question, how can you protect coaches or officials against fake accusations?
Very good question. So what happens, I'll take them in turns. What happens to the people under investigation is really depends on a number of different factors. One thing that we recommend is that to the extent that someone is under investigation, that they be in essence suspended or removed from their functions, official functions, really to protect everyone involved. So to the extent that there's any legitimacy to the allegations, obviously to protect anyone that might be in harm's way, and also to get the individual who then inevitably sort of becomes the target of media interest and potentially unjustified judgment throughout the process, sort of out of the way, and to try to minimize that, right? Because that's a heavy burden as well. And throughout the process, you have to realize that everyone has rights. Everyone has the right to tell their side of the story, to bring evidence that's going to support their case. And that goes to the second question, which is, how do you protect people against false accusations? Really, in the same way that you protect anyone from false accusations in any environment. We apply the rules, we apply the principles of a fair hearing that you would expect in any fair legal system. And so we won't act on the basis of an unsubstantiated accusation. We'll seek corroboration. We'll examine whether or not there's a pattern, whether or not there's other people who tell similar stories. All of these things matter. And part of the trust that we seek to build is one that is the reputation for a robust system that takes everyone's concerns into consideration, takes everyone seriously. But we realize they're sensitive issues, and so process matters. You know, when the issues arise, what decisions get taken initially, and that there it matters what decisions get taken at the national level, at the local level as well, so that everyone is adequately protected. And communication throughout the process, which often, you know, often can't happen to the satisfaction of everyone, because certainly those who wish to know what is happening during the adjudication or during the investigation are not necessarily going to be satisfied, because the process often takes time. But what's important is that those who are the subjects of the process, so i.e. those who are reporting, whether they be whistleblowers, witnesses, victims, know where we are in the process and what's going on and what they can expect. And the same for the accused. They also need to know, you know, what's going on, when they have a right to speak up, when they have a right to bring their point of view to the table as well.
Thank you. One for you again, Alex. How do you make a judgment about historical cases or accusations? Do you have cases like that in your foundation?
So, I mean, I think the question is about, you know, how do you deal with cases that are essentially old cases that occurred at a time when the standards were different and perhaps the rules were different. And
yes, exactly.
You know, today we judge things by a certain standard, and that standard may not have been in place for some time. And I think it's important also from a credibility standpoint not to judge yesterday's occurrences by today's standards. I think we need to realize what the context might have been. That said, there are certain offenses which, you know, regardless of what the standards are today, were simply unacceptable or illegal at the time. And, you know, sexual offenses being the first example among them. And those, which is why, from a regulatory standpoint, you typically have longer statutes of limitations on those sorts of offenses. But it's important to realize that those standards do evolve, and I think when I answered that question in the chat, I mentioned that one of the most powerful voices, or some of the most powerful voices, I think, on this issue are those who experienced or perhaps were the authors of certain acts in the past, who realized that by today's standards, that's no longer acceptable. And to the extent that they come forward and say so, that's an extremely powerful message for those who are witnessing what we're witnessing and are saying, hang on a sec, well, you know, I've done this all along, and it's always been okay. So, you know, why do I need to change? And so I would encourage that. It takes courage to come forward and to say, you know, I realize it's a different world. I did this because, you know, I thought that's how things were done. And I think it's important for that conversation to be had as well.
Thank you, Alex. Got one more question for you again. Do you have any thoughts about how we avoid that sports are getting into questions that should be handled by civil rights system, not necessarily sports related?
So to avoid, yeah, I think I understand the question. So I think, you know, if there are issues that could be, well, actually, I'm not sure I do understand it. Sorry. Okay, here it is.
I'll ask Pia to elaborate if she wants by the chat.
I think that probably the question is, you know, are we getting into an area which is not really for sports to manage, which is really for state authorities to manage?
Yeah.
I think the reality is that there's going to be some overlap regardless, and you know, if we're dealing with this issue in sports today, it's because it's a universal issue. It's a universal issue that that we see is present in sports, and therefore sports has to have a way of dealing with it. It doesn't mean that it's the only actor necessarily that needs to address it, as is you know, as is the fight against doping, where sports organizations and governments need to work together. So I think unfortunately it's not an issue that we can say is solely fits in one box or the other, and we can't avoid it in sports. We need to find ways to address it, and that's why we're here today.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? You can always write them in the Q&A session.
I can ask one question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember we got a question from one of our TC president. I see that she's not here, so that's why I will try to ask that question. It's more a request for advice. She says that the line between pushing for better and verbal abuse is very thin. And who can, I don't know who's from our lecture can advise, but they need advice for coaches.
I'm happy to address that. So, so when we talk about, so there actually isn't a thin line. So we have this idea that there's a thin line. So like escalation of voice to articulate, were you yelling or were you like, because you couldn't hear me across the pitch, right? So, or you know, there was like the level of noise, right? And then there's the verbal abuse, which is the intention to harm. So what was the intention that was driven by the coach to begin with when they were responding in that direction? And so was it to demean, shame, embarrass? Like what was the verbal abuse trying to identify? Was it a technical instruction that was, you know, like to do X on the balance beam, and that there was clear delineation that it was an advancement in your sport? And so when, if it advances the athlete and their knowledge to perform better, then that is not verbal abuse. But if it had an intention behind it, shame, embarrassment, like some of those things, in front of certainly their peers or even individually on their own, then that would fall into a verbal abusive environment, and compounded over time would then lead to an emotional abusive coach.
If I can add something to that, just in the context of physical abuse, is something that I wanted to mention earlier and forgot. And one of the things that we're seeing, you know, there's obviously the physical abuse examples that are sort of clear, which I demonstrated earlier, but I think the ones that are much more problematic are those associated, for example, with training through injury. And that's where I think you might hear this thin line argument of, well, you know, you need to be able to push through the pain to get to that next level. And there's a level at which pushing through pain, especially if you're injured, becomes physical abuse. Certainly if there's knowledge, or there should have been knowledge that perhaps, you know, there's something that's really wrong here, and an injury that needs to be tended to. That I think is a whole area of awareness, especially in gymnastics, that's going to need to be developed. Because I think that, again, we're talking about changing culture. We're talking about changing a culture in which there's a certain accepted notion that you need to work through pain to achieve results, and sometimes that pain is there for a reason, and it's there to prevent injury or further injury.
And if I could just thank you, Alex, for explaining that further. And the point of the athlete integrity program is to be able to develop and be able to articulate those experiences, because often the athlete has owned the story that it's to advance my career. I'm doing this because I have to. Like all the stories
Right.
that the athlete have told themselves. So that's where I'm going to work on to help them articulate, so they don't keep that within themselves, so action can be taken and physical abuse can be identified and responded to clearly and swiftly.
Can I just tag on, just also looking at like some of the comments just in the chat as well, talking about, going back to the first question that Alex got, where an accusation, sometimes there's no, it's hard to defend yourself. And I think one of the things that's really important that we do for our coaches is, right, as a coach, you have to be so safe about your communication and the way that you talk and interact with your athletes. And what this means is, for me, like I said, currently I work with children, right? 12 and 13-year-old boys. Before that, I did a 3-year stint with 11 to 13-year-old girls. I have no direct communication with them. I don't text with them. I'm not on social media with them. I don't do anything like that. Any communication that I have from them from an electronic standpoint goes through their parents. And I understand that, as we're working with older athletes and certain athlete relationships, there's more direct contact. But I think we have to, as coaches, be very smart and very safe. So I use a platform that, hey, all my conversations with anyone, even if it's an individual message, it goes through a parent, but it's recorded. It's there. There's nothing that exists outside of that. If a player texts me, my answer is, hey, you can't text me on here. You need to let's communicate through this platform. And so I think part of being a coach in this day and age as well, in this understanding that the vast majority of our coaches are great people and have the right ideas, is you have to be very smart and safe about all your communications. You can't put yourself in a position where you can't defend yourself. And this is, never to, this is not hiding anything. This is just something that I think it's critical as a coach who's doing it right, that I'm teaching the coaches who work under me as well. I have young coaches who sometimes are only a couple years older than their athletes. You can't text her directly. You can't meet with her one-on-one in a room with a closed door. I mean, there are certain protocols that teachers go through, and I think coaches have to go through them as well. And that is something as federations that we have to keep hitting that message.
John, you're from a team sports background. Is that a difference compared to gymnastics as an individual sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because most of our environments where we're meeting are in a team environment. I do a lot of work in the alpine skiing world, where there is now that individual coach-athlete relationship, plus in alpine skiing, there's a massive amount of travel that you do, even in sort of, not even the highest level, where coaches travel with kids all the time in the van, or sometimes when they work one-on-one. But I do think it goes down to you are still, when you are, trying to coach, you're always coaching one person at a time within that team concept. And so it's being aware of, even within the team dynamic, I'm still going to have individual conversations. And if there's anything that I know after 28 years of coaching, is that, what you say to an athlete and how they hear it are often two very different things. Right. I've had a conversation after a game with a kid and made 9 great things that they're doing well, and then they remember the one thing to work on, and when they get in the car afterwards, they're you know, their first comment to mom or dad is, coach thinks I'm terrible, or something like that. And so we always have to recognize that. So one thing that I always do is, if I have a conversation with an athlete about something, right, and it's one-on-one, it's in a very public place, right, there's all these protocols in place. But if the parents are not present for that, I always follow up with an email to the athlete and parents explaining exactly what was discussed in that conversation, so that there is no confusion of that, right? And so I'm try to be very proactive in those type of discussions. But yeah, I do think team environments are slightly different, but I think team culture, right, is very important, incredibly important, even within individual sports. And part of the culture is this a safe place?
Can I add a little bit onto that? So in my experience working team culture, individual, if the coach is sexually abuse, it doesn't matter if it's an individual or if it's a team environment. And you can have all the greatness if you don't have the structure and teach the athletes on how to communicate to be able to understand what's happening to them. It's going to happen in that environment. And so, and one of the vulnerability areas there is around favoritism. And so that's like a big area within, you're going to find, I've worked with multiple team legal cases, across the gamut. Like I said, every sport has the issue, and it's the dynamic that gets created between the coach and the athlete. And when both sides is out of integrity, meaning that they haven't communicated, somebody's lying about something somewhere. And so that's where the issue then becomes so vulnerable, meaning the athlete isn't speaking up because they're in a compromised situation, and that the coach is not speaking up because they're going to lose their job, and not like they know they're doing something wrong in that regard. So from the team perspective, that's where I feel like the support, there's usually more coaches around than in an individual environment. So I think that's the slight difference that you're going to have as far as like being able to respond. And the real vulnerable environments are these small elite, especially gymnastics communities, small elite gymnastics communities. And it still ends up sort of being a team environment if you have like 30 gymnasts in the environment, based on like the latest like emotional abusive situation out of Maggie Haney in the United States. That was a 30 elite gymnast environment with multiple gymnasts in that environment. And it would have been no different if it was a soccer program or football program or, you know, something of that nature, because it was a contained environment of athletes. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. There is still time for more questions from the audience if wanted.
I've got one more interesting question from Monique. Is there evidence in any sports that using soft skills and training are more effective comparing with a more strict formula? I don't know who wants to answer that.
I don't know. I mean, I've read most of the research or been involved in most of the researchers on this topic. And there is there isn't any evidence-based structure that says you're going to rise to a certain level if you respond this, like if you have soft skills, you're compassionate, you're like I don't believe there's a formal researched program of a paper that's been published. I believe it's something that's desired to be able to have that pursuit and a culture change that we've spoken about, to be able to implement itself within sport, which, and for me, I'm going to say one more thing sort of on that, is that the Olympic ideals, right, are to be like fitter, faster, stronger. I would say them in Latin, but that's not my expertise. And I feel that that's what athletes strive for. Like, we're striving to be the best in the world. And I feel that the same hasn't been a response back by the institutions and the structures that are supporting that. And to me, that's like, so instead of like when we talk about sort of like the same soft skills within sport, I feel that the same sort of soft things within the institutions and the federations can support the structures of sport in that way. Like, it doesn't have to just be the coaches, is what I'm saying. That there's other ways to manage that. And I know I took that conversation slightly off the original basis of it, but essentially, from a formal question, there was no.
Thank you, Katherine. I'll stay with you for one more question. We've talked a lot about sexual abuse and physical abuse. However, there's also a lot of emotional abuse. How do you create awareness about this? Where's the line? How do gymnasts know or realize what's happening to them?
Thank you for that question. So that's also a very strong component of why I'm developing this athlete integrity program, because they don't know, like, they'll articulate what's going on, and it's not in a straight language. It's like they'll talk about a set, or they'll talk about something within their sport, and it's being familiar with, and I mean, thankfully I've become familiar with all the lingo within the various sports, like, you know, so, and so it's being able to understand how emotional abuse manifests itself. And one of the things that I have found is that people, like, sexual abuse has become like a more clear, actionable item. Like, it's clear it's sexual abuse, right? And so then it's like, how do you respond to emotional abuse? And there tends to be this idea that it's a jury-based response to what's going on with the individual. Like, and meaning, what I mean by that is that all the parents get a say, all the other athletes get a say, and they get to determine, this is the myth, the lie in the thing, that they get to determine whether this other athlete is really experiencing emotional abuse. And so what we have taken away is their own intuitive feelings from internally of how they're responding to this coach. We all respond differently to different experiences. We're all brought up differently. Some people, there's no phase to it. They don't hear the intention behind what's being said. And others are so sensitive that they've taken it in as being a response to harm. It's harmed them and their experience of how they perceive life. And so when we get in these situations, I think it's very dangerous to allow your teammates, especially like your peer teammates of like 12 and 13 years old, making a determination of whether or not this other 12 or 13 years old is experiencing emotional abuse from the very same coach doing the very same exercises and having the same outcome. So how do you like make that determination? And so for me, that's like also when I say like give the athlete a voice, like it is the athlete's experience that they have with that. Let's honor it, let's respect it, and let's teach that athlete how to have skills, how one to respond to it, and action can be taken to it. And then let's teach the athlete how to have a different experience within that environment. But this collection idea of like, well, you know, there's 30 people on the team and 28 said they had a great experience and only 2 said it was emotionally abused, therefore it wasn't. And it's not a majority rules experience. And that's what we need to get away from. And it needs to be an individually determined outcome for that athlete, for those facts, for that experience. And that's where I feel a lot of confusion goes in the system when it becomes a collective from everybody around the environment.
Thank you, Katherine. That's quite clear. Lisa, you want to take over?
Yeah, happy to ask a question while maybe our audience still thinks about, and then we also can slowly come to the end. I have one question for Alex, going back to the very beginning. You talked about the safeguarding hotline. We all know from our point of view in gymnastics, of course, that this hotline exists, but how do we get it to the end user? I think for FIG and us, we are partly in a situation that we are sending out information to national federations, but it doesn't always reach until the level very down on the club level. No? This safeguarding hotline, of course, is meant mainly for gymnasts on the club level or of course also on the national team level. No? What can all of us do so that gymnasts actually know and use it in case needed?
Yeah, very, very good question. And I think it's, you know, it's about developing that capacity at the national and club level. So there are, certainly at the FIG level, there's a protocol in place during events to ensure that there's someone who can be approached and that person knows who to contact and so forth. But the question is, how do you replicate that at every level? And I think, you know, it's about awareness. So, you know, I can tell all of you on this call, look, go to the Gymnastics Foundation, ethicsfoundation.org website, and you'll see that you can report there and spread the word in whatever way is appropriate within your community. And if you need help from the FIG to do that, I know that they're there to help, and they've set up a safeguarding unit for that purpose. But we know that you know, as the information trickles down and trickles out to the sides at the local level, we're no longer the best position to spread that message. So that's, you know, I go back to what I said at the beginning about this cultural change and awareness. It's a group effort, and we all have our role to play. So I think you're now all aware that we exist and how we operate. So I'm counting on all of you to spread the word.
We will, of course, do that. Maybe following on that, one last question also to John. John, you've wrote 2 books on these topics, best-selling books. So I'm sure not only read by sports people involved, but also by others. You mentioned before in your presentation that sports needs a cultural change. Do you see a risk that we lose the base for our sports? That people from outside think we're crazy and we will not send the children into elite sports anymore? Do you get these kind of reactions when people read your books?
No, I mean, given that, you know, certainly, you know, when we're talking about elite sport being a very small number of the participants in sport in general, there's always going to be people in sport. I think a really interesting example for that right now might be American football and all the stuff around concussions, right? And so there certainly, their numbers are falling exponentially in terms of youth football participation unless they're changing it because of the fear of injury and concussion and traumatic brain injury. Yet there's still enough people playing that there's going to be people, you know, going through to the elite level. So I think no, but I think this goes back to this whole idea of trust, that if we go long enough, or if we go too long with a lack of trust, where if we think our federations are more concerned with winning a medal than athlete well-being, if we think our local club is more concerned with winning a competition than athlete well-being, then yes, we are going to lose people to elite level sport. But certainly nothing that I ever do or advocate is about not competitive sport or not elite sport. Like, that's what I love, and that was the path that I was on, and I think it's wonderful. But I think we've sort of, I think there's this covenant that has been broken, this covenant between schools and athletes, or sports clubs and athletes, about what you get when you join. And in that it used to be something much greater than it is today in many places, as certainly as the business of sport has grown in North America to $20 billion a year or something is what youth sport generates. And so this covenant is broken, and that's what we have to rebuild, is that trust and this sort of like understanding of what you're signing up for when you do this. And if we do that, then no, we'll never have problems getting people to elite level sport. But if we keep having examples, and let's face it, because of the world we live in 24-hour news cycles, anything that happens now is an international story. We have to be better than we've ever been before about addressing problems and suspending coaches and prosecuting abusers than we ever have before, but also educating coaches, educating parents, helping people understand what good looks like and what unsafe looks like. And I think that's great work that Katherine's doing as well, is she's trying to go club to club, organization to organization, and say within this club, we do things a certain way. And I think that's really, really critical. And I would imagine that any clubs implementing her program wholeheartedly will not have any problems finding athletes to pursue the elite level, because they know that as a parent, I know that my child is in a safe place there.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we're actually already slowly coming to the end of our time. And before we end, I would like to inform our audience that this has been the first webinar of European Gymnastics, but actually soon we'll have a series following from our technical committees about more sports technical topics. Then the information will be sent as usual to our national federations. So stay tuned. And then I would like to thank especially our three speakers, of course. It has been really a very interesting seminar. For us, it was only like the kickoff of the discussion. And we'll have an executive committee meeting at the end of this week where the topic will also be discussed, to see especially what European gymnastics can do in the field of education, because this will be the most important on the long run, of course. Yeah. Thanks a lot to everyone. It has been a great and interesting webinar. And of course, the last word to wrap it up goes to our president.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Indeed, Alex, John, Katherine, you did a great job. Thank you for your interesting presentations. And I think that it was very useful for all of us. Another thanks to Lisa, Tina, and Claire for fantastic organization of that first webinar. And now I have one rhetorical question to all of us. And what is the next? So this is a question to all our participants of today and to all our federations. We are looking feedback from you and maybe some proposals. And what up to us, we have this week executive committee meeting, and we have this question, this topic also on agenda of that meeting. And of course, we will discuss at that level. And then we'll find a decision how we can continue to support our federation with our next action, with providing information and other actions. At the moment, please take care and hope to see you at seminars, not the webinars. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.